Millions of children grew up believing Fred Rogers was the kindest man on television. Most adults believed something very different. They assumed it was an act. After all, nobody could be that patient. Nobody could be that gentle. Nobody could smile like that every single day. Surely, the cameras were hiding the real man. But then something remarkable happened. The people who worked with Fred Rogers for decades, the camera operators, the producers, the makeup artists, the stage crew, they all told the exact same story. When the cameras stopped rolling, he didn't become someone else. If anything, he became even kinder. And that's when a simple television host became one of the greatest mysteries of modern America. Because if kindness wasn't an act, then where did it come from? Stay with us until the end, because the answer isn't what most people expect. It begins long before the famous red sweater, long before television, and long before millions of children learned his name. Long before the television studio, there was a quiet little boy growing up in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Fred wasn't the loudest child. He wasn't the most popular. In fact, he spent much of his childhood alone. He was overweight, often bullied, frequently sick. Many afternoons were spent inside the house while other children played outside. For a young boy, loneliness became a familiar companion. But something unexpected happened during those quiet hours. Instead of becoming bitter, Fred became observant. He listened, he watched, he noticed how words could heal or wound. Years later, he would remember what it felt like to be the child left out. The child nobody noticed. The child who desperately wanted someone to understand. Without realizing it, those painful experiences were quietly shaping his life's mission. Because one day, he would dedicate himself to making sure millions of children never felt invisible again. But before that could happen, something entered his home that would change everything. A television. Like millions of Americans, Fred was fascinated when television first appeared. It felt magical, a box capable of reaching every living room in the country. But the excitement didn't last. One evening, he watched children being entertained through shouting, violence, and humiliation. He was stunned. Not because television existed, but because of what it had chosen to become. Most people would have changed the channel. Fred imagined something completely different. What if television could comfort instead of frighten? What if it could teach kindness instead of conflict? What if one quiet conversation could change a child's life? That single question became an obsession. It was so powerful that Fred made a decision very few people understood. He left a promising career path, studied communication, was ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and quietly devoted himself to a mission unlike anything television had ever seen. Not to preach, not to become famous, but to speak directly to children, with honesty, with respect, with love. Most people believed he had become a television presenter. In reality, Fred Rogers believed he had become something else entirely, a neighbor, someone children could trust, and trust would become the foundation of everything that followed. As Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood slowly found its audience, television executives kept offering advice. The show was too slow, too quiet, too simple. Children, they insisted, needed more excitement. More action, more noise, more entertainment. They believed attention could only be captured through stimulation. Fred believed the exact opposite. He once said that anything truly important in life happens slowly. Trust, friendship, forgiveness, love. None of those things could be rushed. So while the rest of television kept getting louder, Fred kept lowering his voice. While others competed for attention, he competed for trust. Every episode followed almost the same rhythm. The same entrance, the same sweater, the same shoes, the same calm greeting. Some producers feared children would get bored. Instead, millions of children found something they couldn't find anywhere else: safety. But there was something almost nobody knew. Those routines weren't created for television. They were created for the child sitting alone, the child whose parents were divorcing, the child who had been bullied that morning, the child who felt different. Fred wasn't speaking to an audience. He was speaking to one child at a time. And that changes everything. Because if you believe you're talking to millions, you perform. If you believe you're talking to one frightened child, you care. And Fred Rogers cared more deeply than anyone imagined. But the greatest proof of that wasn't on television. It happened long after the cameras stopped rolling. Stay with us, because this is where the real story begins. When filming ended, most television stars went home. Fred's work was only beginning. Every morning before arriving at the studio, he followed almost the same routine. He prayed, not for success, not for ratings, for people, real people, friends, co-workers, children, parents, even strangers whose names had somehow reached him. He kept lists, long lists, people who were sick, people who were grieving, people facing impossible situations. He remembered birthdays, hospital visits, personal struggles. Many never knew they had been part of his daily prayers. And those who worked beside him started noticing something extraordinary. Fred treated the janitor exactly the same way he treated the network executives. He learned everyone's name. He looked people in the eyes. He listened without rushing. He made every conversation feel important. In an industry built on image, he seemed completely uninterested in image. His greatest concern was always the same. How are you? Not as small talk, as a genuine question. Years later, colleagues would say the same thing over and over again. There wasn't a television Fred, and there wasn't a private Fred. There was only Fred. The man on television was exactly the same man who quietly walked through the studio every day. And perhaps that's why so many people found it difficult to believe, because authenticity on that level is incredibly rare. But an event in 1969 would reveal just how courageous his kindness really was. And it would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. America was deeply divided. Fear, anger, racial tension. Even children were growing up surrounded by those divisions. Fred knew he couldn't solve the country's problems, but perhaps he could change one child's heart. During one episode, he invited Officer Clemens, a black police officer on the show, to sit beside him on a hot summer day. Fred filled a small pool with water. Then, without saying a word about politics, he invited Officer Clemens to cool his feet in the same water, a simple gesture. Today it might seem ordinary. Back then, it quietly challenged one of the ugliest symbols of segregation. Even more remarkable, when they finished, Fred used his own towel to dry Officer Clemens' feet. No speeches, no applause, no headlines, just dignity, respect, equality. Millions of children watched. Most never realized they had witnessed history. Fred understood something profound. Children don't learn compassion from lectures. They learn it from examples, and perhaps that single scene said more than an hour-long speech ever could. But if you think this is why people still remember Fred Rogers, the most extraordinary part of his story is still waiting. Because his greatest legacy wasn't built through television. It was built one human being at a time. By now, millions of people believed they knew Fred Rogers. They knew the sweater, the songs, the gentle smile, the quiet voice. But very few people knew what kept that kindness alive for more than 30 years. Because kindness like that doesn't happen by accident. It requires discipline every single day. Fred often described love not as a feeling, but as a choice, a decision you make over and over again, especially on the days when it's hardest. People close to him remember that he followed simple daily rituals. He exercised, he reflected, he prayed, he protected moments of silence, not because he wanted to escape the world, but because he wanted to return to it with a better heart. And perhaps that's the greatest misunderstanding about Fred Rogers. People assumed kindness came naturally to him. In reality, he worked at it every day. Just as an athlete trains their body, Fred trained his character. When someone disappointed him, he chose patience. When someone criticized him, he chose understanding. When the world became louder, he chose to speak more softly. That wasn't weakness. It was extraordinary strength. Because anyone can be kind when life is easy. Remaining kind while carrying the pain of others, that is something entirely different. And the people who knew him best all described the same feeling. Being around Fred Rogers made you want to become a better person. Not because he judged you, but because he believed you already could be. That may have been his greatest gift. He didn't simply teach kindness, he inspired it. When Fred Rogers passed away in 2003, America mourned the loss of a television icon. But something remarkable happened in the years that followed. His influence didn't fade, it grew. Adults who had once watched him as children began sharing stories. Teachers, doctors, firefighters, parents, nurses, military veterans, people from every walk of life. Again and again, they told the same story. When life became difficult, I remembered something Fred Rogers said. It wasn't nostalgia, it was guidance. His words had quietly become part of people's lives, long after the television was switched off. Then social media arrived. Old interviews resurfaced, short clips spread around the world, and a new generation, one that had never grown up with Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, began discovering him for the first time. Something unexpected happened. Young people, raised in an age of endless noise, found themselves captivated by the quietest man on television. In a world chasing attention, Fred Rogers offered presence. In a world rewarding outrage, he chose compassion. In a culture moving faster every year, he reminded people to slow down. His message hadn't become outdated, it had become even more necessary. And perhaps that's why decades later, people still ask the same question. Was he really like that? The answer, according to everyone who knew him, is yes. And somehow, that answer is even more extraordinary than the question. Maybe the greatest mystery surrounding Fred Rogers was never how he spoke to millions of children. It was how he managed to make every single one of them feel as though they were the only child in the world. He never chased fame. He never tried to become a celebrity. He simply believed that every person deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be loved. And perhaps that's why his story still matters today. Not because he entertained millions, but because he quietly reminded millions that kindness is not weakness. It is one of the greatest forms of courage. Behind the red sweater, behind the television set, behind the gentle smile, there wasn't a character. There was a man who chose, every single day, to become the kind of neighbor the world desperately needed. And maybe that's the real reason people still remember him. Not because he was famous, but because he showed us what greatness looks like when no one is trying to impress anyone. So let me ask you something. Did this story change the way you see Fred Rogers? Or perhaps, did it change the way you see kindness itself? I'd genuinely love to read your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. And if you enjoy discovering the hidden side of remarkable people, the stories that exist beyond fame, beyond success, and beyond the spotlight, consider subscribing to See Beyond the Spotlight, because the next story may completely change the way you see someone you thought you already knew.